Have you ever imagined discovering that the quietest farmer in the neighborhood, the man who greeted everyone with a calm smile and cared for his animals with such zeal, hid, behind every ration of food he served, a secret that would keep anyone awake at night? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. For years, the small rural community of Mill Creek believed it lived in peace. The mornings were always the same, the smell of wet earth, the sound of roosters, and old Harold Lewis walking slowly to the barn, accompanied by his dogs. He was the kind of man who seemed born for the country, silent, methodical, and with a look in his eyes that few could decipher. But, like every small town, Mill Creek had its secrets. And the most terrible of them was hidden among the pens, beneath the noise of the pigs and the creaking of the gates. It all started with the disappearances. First it was a drifter, then a hardware salesman passing by on the main road, and soon a young woman from the neighboring town who left to visit her grandmother and never arrived. At first, no one suspected anything. After all, people disappear every day. Sometimes they leave of their own free will. Other times they simply vanish without a trace. But in that isolated patch of countryside, something darker seemed to be stirring in the shadows of Harold's farm. His animals were striking, strong, plump, with a strange gleam in their eyes. It was as if they were healthier than normal. Some locals even joked that he had the golden touch of farmers, but no one imagined that the secret to his livestock's vitality lay in what should never have been used as food. And this is precisely where the story begins to become disturbing. Have you ever noticed how evil sometimes disguises itself as normality? How can some people live among us, greet us, smile, and still hide their true selves? Harold was like that. He attended fairs, sold fresh meat at the local market, and even offered help when someone needed it. An ordinary man, anyone would say. But behind the high walls of the farm, surrounded by hungry animals, he fed something far more dangerous than pigs and cows. He fed an addiction, a compulsion that grew alongside the silence of the city. Neighbors began commenting on the strong smell coming from the property, especially at night. Harold said it was manure, that the heat made the odor spread, and since no one wanted to pry into the old man's affairs, the case was forgotten. Until one day, a police officer noticed something strange in the missing person reports. Almost all the last people seen had passed near the Lewis farm. Coincidence? Perhaps. But from then on, each new clue led back to the same iron gate, covered in rust and silence. The scariest thing is that until that moment, no one, absolutely no one, suspected that the food given to the animals contained something that should never have been found there. Crushed bones, fragments of human tissue, pieces that would take months for science to identify. What the police discovered in that soil completely changed the way the town viewed the good farmer. What if I told you that part of this story never made it into the newspapers? That there are details that were omitted, perhaps because they were too disturbing for the public? The Harold Lewis case isn't just about a killer, it's about how evil can flourish in the silence of everyday life, in the apparent normalcy of an ordinary man. What you're about to hear reveals the darkest side of human nature and perhaps makes you look differently at those who seem too innocent. Because on that forgotten farm, the real food was never in the bags of feed, but in the people who disappeared without a trace. Have you ever stopped to think about how, sometimes, the most peaceful face can hide the most disturbing secret? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover now may surprise you. Harold Mason was the kind of man that everyone in the small town of Cold Creek, deep in the American countryside, respected. A simple, soft-spoken farmer with a worn straw hat and hands marked by hard work. He lived alone on an old property surrounded by acres of arid land and a barbed wire fence that seemed more like a boundary between the civilized world and something time had forgotten. To his neighbors, Harold was a reserved man, eccentric perhaps, but never dangerous. And it was precisely this ordinary appearance that allowed him to hide one of the most macabre secrets in rural American history. Cold Creek had a population of just over 1,000. It was a place where time seemed to slow down and where every face was familiar. Mornings began with the sound of church bells and ended with the sound of crickets and the rustling of wind in the fields. Nothing unusual until the disappearances began. First, a trucker who stopped to ask for directions and was never seen again. Then, a cosmetic saleswoman who used to pass by the main road simply vanished. And then, a young man from the neighboring town who went hunting and never returned. The police investigated, but in such an isolated region, disappearance could mean many things. Escape, kidnapping, even an accident in the woods. No one imagined the clues were right there in plain sight, mixed with the mud, the smell of feed, and the hungry gaze of Mr. Mason's animals. The curious thing is that while families mourned the lost, Harold continued his routine. He woke at 5, fed the pigs, cleaned the pens, and sold meat and milk at local markets. Always helpful, always with a discreet smile. Many said he was the last real farmer in the region, someone who kept the old traditions alive. And perhaps they were right, just not in the way they imagined. Have you ever noticed how evil often hides behind routine? How the worst monsters sometimes disguise themselves as ordinary men? Harold knew this. He was the kind of person no one noticed for too long, and it was precisely this anonymity that gave him freedom. Rumors began when residents noticed strange behavior among the farm animals. Pigs were larger than normal, dogs were unusually aggressive, and a strong odor seemed to permeate the air at nightfall. Some said the odor came from the fertilizer, others swore it was coming from the barn, and some even heard sounds coming from underground, as if something or someone was moving inside. But in Cold Creek, curiosity was always a dangerous luxury. Those who asked too many questions ended up being seen as gossipers, or even disappearing altogether. And Harold knew how to use this to his advantage. He'd look at people with that calm expression and say, "The countryside has its mysteries, and not all of them are meant to be unearthed." As the years passed, the town grew accustomed to the idea that some disappearances would never be solved, and the old farmer remained there, steadfast, feeding his animals, selling fresh meat at the local market, and maintaining his reputation as a man of his word. No one suspected that, behind that rusty gate, lurked a secret so dark that the land itself seemed silent. What few knew was that the tranquility of Cold Creek was about to crumble, and when the truth came out, Harold Mason's name would never be forgotten. Because sometimes evil lurks not in the shadows of the big city, but in the places no one thinks to look. Have you ever wondered what happens when an entire town decides to believe nothing wrong is happening? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you, and maybe even change the way you view the silence of places too small to hide secrets too big. The disappearances began subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if the city itself, Cold Creek, wanted to deny what was before his eyes. It was the autumn of 1993 when Ellen Brooks Ellen, a 22-year-old woman, disappeared on her way home from work. Her car was found parked on the side of the road, the keys still in the ignition, and a bag of groceries on the passenger seat. Police treated it as a voluntary escape. Ellen must have left with someone, they said. After all, in Cold Creek, no one believed anything truly bad could happen. 2 weeks later, Michael Turner, a street vendor who used to stop by town every 2 weeks, also disappeared. His delivery truck was found empty, the radio still on, the engine cold. A police officer even mentioned that Michael's last recorded sale had been to the old man, Harold Mason, the farmer who lived on the outskirts of town, but no one paid any attention. Harold wouldn't hurt a fly, they said, and with that, the case was shelved. Another among the many mysteries that time takes care of burying. As the months passed, the sense of normalcy turned to unease. Rumors began to spread, whispered in school hallways, church pews, and grocery store lines. Some residents claimed to smell a strong odor coming From the Mason farm at night, a bittersweet, heavy, impossible-to-ignore odor. Others swore they heard strange noises coming from the barn, like muffled grunts, chains, and something that sounded like screaming. But there was always someone ready to explain. It must just be the wind, or the pigs fighting over their food. Have you ever lived in a place where fear is so intense that people would rather make excuses than face the truth? Cold Creek was exactly like that. Every new absence was dismissed as a coincidence, every piece of evidence ignored as easily as turning off a light. The police, under no resources and pressured to not cause panic, attributed everything to family feuds, debts, or runaway lovers. No one wanted to believe that something darker might be going on, especially if it meant getting a closer look at the man everyone knew, but no one really saw. While the villagers tried to get on with their lives, Harold continued his routine unperturbed. He would wake before sunrise, feed the animals, clean the pens, and spend the rest of the day isolated, surrounded by the sound of grunts and heavy footsteps on the mud. Sometimes he could be seen driving his old truck along the main road, carrying bags of feed and meat to sell. He would greet passers-by with a curt wave, his gaze calm and distant. No one realized how much that look hid. The most disturbing thing was the contrast. While entire families scoured the woods searching for missing people, the farmer seemed to live in peace. No worries, no comments on the matter, just a solitary man devoted to the fields and his animals. But there was something in his eyes, something cold, impassive, as if each new absence only fueled a secret that grew along with the sound of the pigs in their pens. Over time, the disappearances became part of everyday life. It was as if Cold Creek had learned to live with the inexplicable. The town continued to function. The days went on, and the Mason farm remained, silent, shrouded in mist and mystery. The smells, the sounds, the shadows, all were ignored in the name of tranquility. But every denial has a limit, and in that forgotten city, the limit was about to be crossed, because the next disappearance would not be of a stranger. Have you ever imagined what you would feel if you discovered that your neighbor, the same man you greet every day with a calm wave, was hiding on his own farm, the scene of one of the most disturbing crimes the country has ever seen? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may leave you speechless. For years, the farm of Harold Mason was just another forgotten property in the interior of Cold Creek, a secluded spot, surrounded by gnarled trees and a silence broken only by the distant mooing of oxen and the heavy grunt of pigs. For the residents, this landscape was a natural part of their daily routine, until something started to smell wrong. Literally, a strong, almost unbearable odor began to permeate the air, especially at night. Some said it was accumulated manure. Others claimed Harold had started using a new type of feed, but no one dared go there to check. It was the police officer Daniel Cooper who first suspected something was not right. He had been called to investigate the disappearance of a local teenager, Tommy Blake, the fourth case in less than 6 months. The trail always ended at the same point, the dirt road that led to the Mason farm. Daniel, known for his persistence, decided to go there himself. It was late afternoon when the sun began to set behind the fields, casting long shadows over the corrals. He parked the car and called for Harold. No answer, only the distant sound of something being dragged inside the barn. "Mason!" he called out again, but the silence seemed thicker than air. Then he noticed, on the side of the sheds, there was a trail of marks on the ground, something like deep grooves, mixed with small dark spots. The officer followed the tracks to a fenced-in area where Harold used to feed his pigs. It was there that the smell became unbearable, a sweet, rotten smell that made his stomach churn. Daniel tried to pull back the tarp covering one of the barrels, and what he saw, not even years of service had prepared him for. Among the shredded feed were bones, small, fine, some still with traces of dry tissue. He recoiled instinctively, covering his face with his forearm, and stumbled backward. His breathing quickened. His confused mind tried to find a logical explanation, but there was none. In the following days, the police dug up the land around the property, and each new shovelful of dirt revealed more than anyone could handle. Human remains were buried near the corral, mixed with rusty tools and chains. The case became a collective nightmare. Journalists surrounded the city, and the name Harold Mason printed the headlines, "The farmer who fed his animals missing people." While authorities gathered evidence, Harold was found, sitting on the porch, calmly watching the sunset as if nothing had happened. When questioned, he simply smiled and said, "Animals need to eat, and the earth, too." Have you ever heard a sentence so simple yet so devastating? The local sheriff described that moment as the instant the air seemed to stop. None of the deputies could hold his gaze for long. There was something profoundly empty in his eyes, a complete lack of remorse, as if he were talking about any ordinary field task. The news spread like wildfire. The residents, incredulous, refused to believe that the man who helped at the markets, repaired fences, and donated milk to the local orphanage could do something like this. Some said Harold was the victim of a setup. Others claimed he was possessed. But the truth was there, on the farm's floor, in the shallow graves, and in the feed that researchers collected with trembling gloves. What happened on that farm forever changed Cold Creek's view of its own innocence. And yet, the most disturbing part was yet to come, because Harold's confession, or what he called his vindication, would reveal something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Have you ever wondered what goes on in the mind of someone capable of turning their own farm into a hidden cemetery? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you, and perhaps make you question how much we really know the people around us. After the horrors were uncovered, the name Harold Mason became synonymous with something that even psychology didn't seem ready to explain. While authorities tried to understand as he managed to hide so many crimes, psychiatrists wanted to know why. What kind of mind is capable of living among corpses, feeding animals with human remains, and still sleeping peacefully every night? Was it coldness, madness, or something much deeper and more frightening? During interrogations, Harold appeared calm, cooperative, and even polite. He spoke slowly, without hesitation, and without showing any remorse. He described the process of feeding the animals as naturally as someone talking about planting corn. When asked about the victims, he didn't deny it. He simply smiled and said, "They were where they were supposed to be." A simple sentence, but laden with a twisted logic that made the experts realize Harold wasn't acting on impulse. He believed in what he was doing. The psychiatrist, Dr. Evan Crawford, responsible for the initial report, described Harold as a man who found pleasure in absolute control over life and death. According to him, the farmer didn't see his victims as people, but as part of a natural cycle, a resource, a means to sustain what he considered his perfect order. This idea of morbid balance, of nourishing life with death, recurred in his speeches as if he truly believed he was fulfilling a necessary function. Have you ever met someone who seemed completely normal, but had a look that chilled the room? People like that exist, and Harold was one of them. Witnesses said he had a gift for appearing trustworthy. His steady gaze, calm voice, slow gestures, a man who inspired respect, even empathy. And that's what makes it all the more disturbing. The monster didn't hide in the shadows. He lived in the light of day. Experts have compared the Harold Mason case to little-known but equally enigmatic killers, such as Robert Picton, the Canadian farmer who also fed his pigs human remains, or Joe Matheny, the trucker who sold meat mixed with the remains of his victims at roadside snack bars. Like them, Harold seemed driven not just by sadism, but by an almost ritualistic need to prove he was in control of everything. According to a study by the Chicago Institute of Criminal Psychology, about 80% of rural serial killers share similar traits. social isolation, above-average intelligence, childhood trauma, and an obsessive relationship with animal death. Harold fit the bill. From a young age, he was known for dissecting small animals with almost surgical precision, something that at the time was dismissed as scientific curiosity. But this curiosity grew, evolved, and over time became something entirely different, a form of power. What struck the researchers most was the complete absence of emotion, no hatred, no rage, no explicit pleasure. Just cold mathematical logic. For him, everything had a purpose, and if people disappeared, it was simply part of an inevitable cycle. Nothing is lost, everything is transformed, he said in one of the interviews, with a tone that seemed almost philosophical. And that's where the true terror lies, because Harold Mason wasn't your typical crazed killer, nor a man driven by rage. He was methodical, rational, someone who saw beauty where the rest of the world saw horror. And perhaps that's why his case continues to intrigue experts to this day, not for the brutality itself, but for the calm way he justified it. Evil sometimes doesn't scream. It speaks softly, smiles, and waits patiently for you to believe it. And when you realize what's behind that calm gaze, it's already too late. Do you believe that justice truly brings peace after such a horror? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. The arrest of Harold Mason was anything but ordinary. After the discoveries on the farm, the buried bones, the rusted tools, and the feed mixed with human remains, the small town of Cold Creek plunged into a state of collective shock. The most respected farmer in the region, the man everyone had known forever, was now handcuffed in the back seat of a patrol car, surrounded by reporters, onlookers, and neighbors who could hardly believe their eyes. The sirens cut through the early morning silence like blades, illuminating Harold's impassive face, which remained silent, staring blankly into space. In court, the case attracted national attention. Cameras crowded the door, and newspapers across the country splashed headlines about the cannibal farmer of Cold Creek. During the trial, each detail revealed seemed more absurd than the last. Prosecutors described the evidence they had gathered in unwavering tones: charred bones near the barnyard, human remains inside the frozen meat, drag marks on the property's ground. The defense, desperate, tried to plead insanity. But Harold, in a calm, chilling tone, insisted there was nothing wrong with him, that he simply fed life with what life itself discarded. Can you imagine hearing that from someone without feeling a chill? The jurors, in absolute silence, watched this simple-looking man, dressed in farmer's clothes and with calloused hands, speak about death with philosophical serenity. It was as if there was no guilt, only conviction. Some said he believed he was doing nature a favor. Others claimed he simply enjoyed playing God. The sentence came quickly: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But even upon hearing the verdict, Harold showed no reaction. No tears, no tremors, nothing. Just a hollow, profound gaze that seemed to pierce the judge and reach far beyond the courtroom. He was taken under heavy guard to a maximum security prison, where he would spend the rest of his life, and where, according to reports, he maintained the same serene, almost meditative demeanor until the end of his days. Meanwhile, in Cold Creek, the panic was turning into legend. The farm was sealed off, and for months no one dared approach. The smell still lingered in the air, even after the police had cleaned it up. It was said that the surviving animals never behaved the same way again, that they would stir at night, staring into space as if waiting for someone who would never return. Over time, vegetation took over. The fences collapsed, the barn collapsed, and stories began to circulate. Some swore they heard screams coming from the woods. Others claimed to see lights in the old main house. The press kept returning, year after year, seeking new angles on the same horror. Some documentarians tried to portray the case as a psychological study of human perversity. Others treated it as morbid curiosity, a story made to scare and sell headlines. But for those who lived through it, there was nothing fictional about it. Cold Creek was never the same. Families moved, the church lost members, and Harold Mason's name became taboo. No one dared speak it aloud anymore. Have you ever felt the weight of a place carrying the memory of evil? That kind of energy that seems to linger there, even after everything is over? Well, yes. Harold's farm was demolished years later, but the land remained empty, surrounded by tall weeds and silence. And according to some residents, this silence isn't always absolute. Sometimes on moonless nights, when the wind blows from the north and the countryside seems to sigh, you can still hear the distant sound of pigs and the soft click of the gate opening, as if someone were returning to feed the animals. Do you really know the people around you? Have you ever considered how many secrets might be hidden behind a polite smile, a simple good morning, or a seemingly peaceful farm fence? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to hear now could change the way you see the world around you. The case of Harold Mason, the farmer who fed missing people to his animals, is more than a horror story. It's a distorted mirror of human nature. It forces us to face an uncomfortable truth. Evil often doesn't wear grotesque masks or live in the shadows of big cities. Sometimes it lurks in ordinary places, in simple routines, in the calloused hands of a man who seemed incapable of hurting even a fly. Since her arrest, the little girl Cold Creek was never the same again. Harold's name was erased from local records, but the echo of his deeds still resonates across the silent fields. Longtime residents say that, after his conviction, the wind that blows through the lands never sounded the same. Some say it's just imagination. Others claim there are nights when the past returns, disguised as noises from the woods, distant grunts, slow footsteps on the damp earth. It's as if the farm itself still holds memories that refuse to die. The case sparked the interest of criminologists, psychiatrists, and curious individuals worldwide. Documentaries, reports, and even books have attempted to decipher the mind of a seemingly ordinary man who saw horror as a form of balance. But perhaps the most frightening answer is the simplest. He believed he was right. This cold conviction, this serenity in the face of monstrosity, is what most disturbs those who study his story to this day. And it's impossible not to wonder, how many other Harolds are out there, disguised as exemplary citizens, living among us? Would you trust your neighbor if you knew what they did when no one was looking? That's the most disturbing part of this kind of true crime. It shatters the illusion that we recognize evil when we see it. The case also served as a wake-up call for authorities. The flaws in the initial investigations, the disappearances ignored, the complaints treated as gossip, all of this showed how negligence can fuel horror. If anyone had paid attention to the early signs, perhaps the outcome would have been different. But Cold Creek chose silence, and silence, in this case, was complicit. Today, Harold's farm is nothing more than an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and the passage of time. No one comes near after sunset. Some say it's superstition. Others swear they've seen lights turning on by themselves in the darkness, as if the place still breathes. No one knows for sure what's real or what the mind creates when fear isn't completely erased. Cases like this remind us that the truest horror isn't found in movies or urban legends. It's found in real stories, in ordinary people, in lives intersected with the inexplicable. And that's why each new episode of this channel exists, to expose what many prefer to forget, to show that the truth can be far more terrifying than any fiction. If this story shocked you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss any future episodes, and trust me, what comes next will leave you breathless. Now I want to know, what bizarre crime or dark story do you want me to tell in the next video? Leave a comment below. Your suggestion could become the next case that keeps you up at night. Have you ever imagined living for years alongside someone who carries a secret so dark, so unimaginable, that your entire perception of what is normal simply crumbles when the truth comes out? It's curious how, sometimes, The greatest horrors aren't hidden in the shadows, but in the light of day, in the simple gestures, the polite smile, the seemingly ordinary routine of people no one would ever suspect. Harold Mason was exactly that, a farmer of a simple life, a reserved man, but known for his discipline, his punctuality, and above all, the careful way he treated his animals. It was as if there existed a silent connection between him and every creature that lived on that land. What no one knew is that this connection came at a price the town would only discover when it was too late. For years, residents of Cold Creek, they passed the road that led to the farm and saw the same scene, old Harold in a straw hat, standing beside the corral, watching the sunset. It looked like a living painting of rural American life, peaceful, almost poetic, but there was something unsettling about the silence. The sounds of the farm were strange, almost hypnotic. Grunts, the metallic clang of tools, the sound of something being dragged across the clay floor. And somehow, it all seemed natural. People get used to the repetitive, even when the repetitive is the absurd. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what makes this story so disturbing is not just the crime itself, but the time it took to uncover it. It shows how much a community's mindset can be shaped by habit, by blind trust, by the desire to believe that evil is always far away. This human need to preserve the illusion of safety is what allows secrets like Harold's to survive for so long. The hidden truth behind the farm began to emerge almost poetically, as if the land itself were tired of remaining silent. The smell, that was the first sign. A dense odor, sweet and putrid at the same time, that seemed to refuse to disappear, even after the rain. Then came the rumors, sounds at night, lights burning late, the sudden increase in the animal population. But no one said anything, and when someone dared to ask, Harold would respond with that calm, almost paternal tone. Nature has its cycles, and not everyone needs to understand. These words today sound like a warning, and perhaps, in a way, they were, because Harold's mind worked in a peculiar way, a kind of symbiosis between rationality and delirium. He believed he was part of something greater, a transformation that only he understood. This was his justification, and this is where the story takes on an almost philosophical depth. The moment when the criminal begins to see himself as a messenger, an instrument, someone chosen to fulfill a purpose that goes beyond common comprehension. This is the point where human being and monster merge, and where crime ceases to be just an action and becomes an ideology. The impact on the community was devastating. When the police finally discovered what was happening, the shock came not only from the brutality of the events, but from the feeling of collective betrayal. This man everyone trusted, who mended fences, helped neighbors, and sold fresh milk at the local market, had turned his own farm into a moral abyss. And the question that echoed afterward was simple, yet terrible. How did no one notice? This is the scariest part of this journey. The idea that evil doesn't need to hide to thrive, it just needs to be ignored. And this ignorance is fueled by small gestures, indifference, the fear of interfering, the assumption that it would never happen here. This is how monsters feed, not just on victims, but on silence. Harold's case is more than a tragedy. It's a reminder that every decision, every choice to look or look away, has an impact. Because while the town pretended not to notice the smell, the sound, and the disappearances, Harold continued his routine. He fed his animals, smiled at his neighbors, and kept normalcy alive. He knew that the truth, when revealed, would be devastating. But he also knew that people's fear of seeing reality worked in his favor. What strikes me most about this story is how much it reflects something beyond crime. It's about mindset, about the power of habit and denial, about how sometimes we'd rather live in a comfortable illusion than face an uncomfortable truth. Because truth, that word that seems so liberating, can also be destructive. It changes everything, and once revealed, it can never be forgotten. Perhaps that's why Cold Creek hasn't fully recovered to this day. Even after his arrest, even after the destruction of the farm, Harold Mason's name still haunts the place. No one speaks of him openly, but everyone feels his presence. The field where the corral once stood remains empty, and they say that sometimes at dusk you can hear the distant sound of footsteps on the clay. Slow, shuffling footsteps, as if someone still tends to the invisible animals that remain there. Stories like this make us rethink what we call security. The real threat rarely comes from the unknown. It's usually right beside us, silent, predictable, dressed in routine. And that's what makes it all the more uncomfortable, realizing that evil isn't an isolated accident, but a natural consequence of a society that avoids confronting its own shadow. And, strange as it may seem, there's something transformative about this. Because when we understand what drove Harold to do what he did, and more importantly, what led everyone else to ignore what was happening, the story stops being just about him. It becomes about us, about how we deal with fear, with truth, with the choices that shape the fine line between right and wrong. The horror of Harold Mason isn't just in the shallow graves or the old headlines. It's in the revelation that the human mind, when corrupted by the illusion of power and emotional blindness, can create justifications for anything. And this, more than any detail of the crime, is what truly haunts us. Comment here. That makes sense to me. In small towns, time seems to move slowly, and people know each other by name, by their habits, by the smells that each house releases when the wind changes direction. Cold Creek, it was exactly like that. One of those places that seem stuck in another century, where nothing extraordinary ever happens. Dirt roads, farms far apart, and a routine so predictable that any unusual noise was cause for whispers. It was in this setting that I lived. Harold Mason, a tall, broad-shouldered, middle-aged farmer with a tired look, the kind of man who seemed to have been born and grown old under the same sun. Everyone knew him, and everyone trusted him. Harold was the epitome of what Cold Creek considered an exemplary citizen. He worked from dawn to dusk, never owed anyone anything, and when he appeared in town, he was always discreet. A man of few words, he almost always wore a hat and muddy boots. His elders described him as someone from the old days, one who still believed in the value of the land and the loyalty of animals. Apparently, he lived in harmony with everyone and everything, but like every story that begins with a peaceful appearance, there was something no one saw. The Mason farm sat secluded at the end of a winding road, surrounded by tall pines that cast long shadows in the evening. Visitors rarely went beyond the main gate. Harold said the pigs were temperamental, that strangers made the animals nervous. And indeed, passers-by heard low, muffled grunts mixed with metallic clangs. Nothing too unusual for a rural property. But there was something in the air, a sweet, heavy, almost chemical smell that lingered even after the rain. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is precisely in this contrast between the ordinary and the strange that the essence of this story lies. Evil rarely arrives with a warning. It creeps in slowly, like mold growing silently on walls, and that's exactly what happened in Cold Creek. The first signs that something was wrong came subtly. A tool salesman traveling through the area disappeared without a trace. Then a young woman named Ellen Brooks, who used to visit his mother on the neighboring farm, never returned home. At first, authorities dismissed it as coincidence. The roads were dangerous, the fields vast, and people sometimes simply left. The local sheriff even remarked, "In Cold Creek, things disappear more easily than they appear." But as time passed, the disappearances began to follow a pattern. People last seen near the Mason property. Vehicles found abandoned on the road, with the keys still in the ignition, torn clothing near streams, and the same strange smell which no one could explain. Even so, fear wasn't enough to break the silence. No one wanted to believe Harold could be involved. He was a man of the land, one of us, they said. Gradually, the town's atmosphere shifted. Conversations at the bar grew shorter, windows began to close earlier, and even the dogs seemed restless. There was an invisible tension in the air. People avoided looking directly at the farm as they passed. It was as if Cold Creek knew, even if it didn't want to admit it, that something very wrong lurked there. Harold, for his part, seemed oblivious to everything. He continued his routine with almost mechanical precision. He fed the animals at the same time each day, worked in the fields until dusk, and sometimes stood in front of the pen for long minutes, observing the pigs with a hollow, profound gaze. The few who dared to speak to him said he seemed increasingly distant, as if a part of him had disconnected from the world. And this is where the mystery takes on another layer, because to the outsider, Harold was just a weary farmer, a survivor of a hard life. But inside, something was changing, a kind of rupture. Between man and morality, between the everyday and the darkness. This transformation is the point where the story ceases to be about a simple disappearance and becomes a study of the human mind, about how loneliness, isolation, and the power to manipulate reality itself can erode any trace of empathy. Rumors began to spread. Some swore they'd seen Harold burying something in the early hours of the morning. Others said they'd heard muffled screams coming from the farm as the wind blew from the north. No one had proof, and no one wanted any, because knowing the truth would require courage to face what was happening, and in Cold Creek, courage was in short supply. Fear mixed with curiosity, and the two became complicity. People would rather make up stories than face the real possibility of living next to a killer. And Harold knew this. He understood how silence worked. He used the city's predictability as a shield. He knew that as long as he greeted people at the market and sold fresh milk, no one would dare question what he did behind those rusty gates. This is the hidden truth behind stories like this. Evil doesn't need to be grandiose to be effective. It just needs an environment that tolerates it. Ellen Brooks's disappearance, the missing trucker, the salesman who never returned, all of these could have been investigated sooner. But Cold Creek chose to turn a blind eye. It chose the peace of denial over the pain of revelation. And perhaps that's why, when the truth finally came out, no one could sleep for weeks. Because it wasn't just about what Harold had done. It was about what everyone had failed to do. The weight of those decisions, or lack thereof, fell upon every resident, and the echoes of that are still felt today, in the whispers, the memories, the stories the elders tell only after the sun has set. In the end, Harold Mason wasn't just a farmer. He was a reflection of an entire community that chose to believe comfortable lies. And perhaps this is the cruelest part of this journey, realizing that sometimes the monster we fear isn't outside, it's inside, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Comment here. That makes sense to me. It was on a cold November night that the first disappearance occurred. Ellen Brooks, Ellen, the young woman who used to walk across the fields of Cold Creek to visit her mother, was never seen again. She left home carrying a flashlight and a basket of bread and cheese, something she did often, especially on Friday nights. But that night, something changed. The trail leading to the road was empty, and when day broke, her dog was found howling near Harold Mason's fence, covered in mud and looking frightened. No one suspected anything. They said Ellen must have run off with some boy from the neighboring town. It was easier to believe that than to imagine otherwise. In the following months, the pattern repeated itself. A truck driver named Robert Long disappeared while delivering feed to local farms. His truck was found parked on the side of the road, the engine still hot and the keys in the ignition. Inside was an empty lunchbox and a radio on, emitting only static. Local police classified it as another case of voluntary absconding. These outsiders always disappear, the sheriff said, but those who lived in Cold Creek knew something strange was going on. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what makes this story so uncomfortable is not just the disappearance of the people, but the way the town reacted to it, or rather, how it didn't react. Silence was the community's first line of defense. People spoke quietly in the markets, whispered in the church, but no one asked questions out loud. It was as if Cold Creek had made an unconscious pact with its own fear. Over time, the signs multiplied. Animals began acting strangely, dogs howling for no reason, horses refusing to cross the Mason Farm road, and birds circling, as if something attracted or repelled them from the place. At night, some residents claimed to hear metallic sounds coming from the barns, the dragging of chains, the clanking of buckets, and sometimes something that sounded like a muffled scream. But in the morning, everything returned to normal. Harold Mason was there, calmly feeding his pigs, waving to passers-by, and pretending nothing had changed. The police only began to really investigate when Tommy Blake, a teenager known for helping out on local farms, disappeared after telling friends he was going to Harold's property to deliver a bag of corn. He never returned. His bicycle was found discarded near the fence, the front tire still spinning. From that moment on, fear went from rumor to reality. Even so, the sheriff tried to calm the crowd. He said the boy must have gotten lost in the woods and would soon be found, but no one believed him anymore. Tension mounted like a storm about to break. The smell coming from the farm grew stronger, a sweet, cloying odor that seemed to cling to the clothes of those passing by. Some tried to justify it by saying Harold must have been burning the remains of dead animals, a common occurrence on rural properties. Others began to avoid the road altogether. Still, no one had the courage to confront him. He was the kind of man who commanded respect with just a look. Meanwhile, Harold continued his unperturbed routine. He left early, returned at dusk, and was rarely seen outside the estate. Those who encountered him in town said he seemed peaceful but quieter than usual. His eyes, once watchful, now seemed to gaze at a distant point, as if observing something no one else could see. It was strange behavior, but no one dared comment. The town was afraid of names, afraid of coincidences. What no one knew was that, inside that farm, time followed a different logic. The barn had become a kind of grotesque laboratory where Harold tested the boundaries between what was useful and what was disposable. He believed he was being practical, that he was simply using what nature provided. The victims' remains were ground up, mixed with feed, and fed to the pigs, animals that, ironically, were his greatest source of pride. For him, it was a perfect cycle. Nothing was wasted, everything was transformed. Residents began to suspect something more concrete when a group of hunters reported seeing smoke coming from the farm's chimney at 3 in the morning. They also said the smell was different, reminiscent of burning flesh. Still, the police insisted on taking no action. It was as if fear and denial had become Harold's invisible allies, and that's the most frightening part. How collective silence can be as complicit as the criminal himself. As the months passed, Cold Creek became a broken town. There were those who believed the stories and lived in terror, and those who refused to accept any possibility of horror. For them, it was easier to blame fate or invent romantic escapes than to admit that something monstrous was happening there, right under their noses. The contrast was stark. On one side, desperate mothers praying in church, begging for answers. On the other, Harold, arms crossed, staring impassive into the distance. He never tried to escape, never showed any hurry, never changed his routine. And that's what's most disturbing, the serenity with which evil acts when it believes itself in control. And time went on. The searches slowed, the families grew weary, and Cold Creek, little by little, returned to its routine as if the horror had been swallowed by oblivion. But silence, the kind of silence that only exists when the truth is buried, still hung over the town. It was the kind of silence that precedes a revelation, one of those moments when normalcy is merely a disguise for tragedy, until one day the unexpected happened. A stronger smell, a rain that ran down the road, bringing with it a dark, dense residue. It was the sign no one wanted to see, but which would finally shake cold. Greek from its torpor, because what was hidden beneath the earth was slowly beginning to emerge, and when the truth refuses to stay buried, it always finds a way to resurface. Comment here. That makes sense to me. The rain that morning felt different. It fell heavily, insistently, as if the sky wanted to wash away something, even it couldn't bear to carry any longer. The strong smell coming from the Mason farm permeated the humid air, and this time, no one could ignore it. The water running down. The road had a dark, almost reddish hue, and that was what caught everyone's attention. Daniel Cooper, a veteran cop who no longer believed in coincidences. He was the kind of man who knew the silence of small towns, the weight of secrets everyone pretends not to see. When he saw that dirty water flowing down Harold Mason's gate, he knew something there had finally reached its limit. Daniel parked the car in front of the fence. The farm was silent, except for the rhythmic sound of rain hitting the tin roof. He called to Harold once, twice, 3 times. No answer. The wind rattled the barn doors, the creaking sound, almost a whisper. As he approached, he noticed the smell. It was unlike anything he had ever smelled, thick, sweet, and bitter all at once. A scent that clung to his skin, as if it had a life of its own. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because what happened next is the kind of revelation that completely transforms the mindset of a community, that changes the way people see the world and each other. It's the moment when the hidden truth can no longer be contained, and its impact is so great that not even time can erase it. When the officer pushed open the barn door, the sound that came from inside was almost human. A low hiss, mixed with grunts and heavy breathing. The air was thick with steam and metal. Daniel turned on his flashlight, and as the light filtered through the room, he noticed what appeared to be a pile of feed. But something about the mixture caught his attention. Small, irregular shapes, dull gleams, contours that didn't belong in nature. As he got closer, the beam of light revealed the impossible. Bones, small bones, mixed with the pig's feed. For a few seconds, Daniel stood still. His body knew what he was seeing before his mind accepted it. His breathing quickened and his stomach churned. He took a step back, tripping over a tool on the ground. It was a shovel, fitted with almost surgical precision, the handle sanded and reinforced with metal. The edges were stained, but not with dirt. The police officer staggered out of the barn and called for backup. Within an hour, the farm was surrounded by patrol cars. Armed men, yellow tape, camera flashes, and a crowd of residents huddled in the distance, trying to understand what was happening. No one spoke loudly. It was as if everyone was afraid of waking something still sleeping under the mud. The excavations began near the corral. The earth, soaked by the rain, gave way easily, and the deeper they dug, the more hope faded. What the police found there surpassed any possibility of denial. Human remains, scraps of clothing, tools adapted for grinding meat. Nothing explicit, but enough to paint a complete picture of a horror that had been brewing for years. When they finally found Harold, he was sitting on the porch, soaked to the skin, staring out at the field with a distant gaze. He didn't try to run away, didn't resist, didn't show any surprise. When the police officer approached and announced the arrest, Harold just smiled, a small, almost polite smile, and said, "Animals need to eat, sir, and the earth needs what is hers." Those words fell like a blow. No one responded. It was impossible to tell if it was irony, delirium, or a truth too twisted to comprehend. The silence that followed was heavier than the rain itself. In the following days, Cold Creek became a nightmare scenario. The farm was cordoned off, and forensic teams from across the state were called in. News spread quickly. Headlines, reporters, cameras, curious onlookers. People wanted to see the farmer who fed missing people to his animals. Authorities tried to maintain control, but curiosity overcame fear. And behind it all, a collective sense of disbelief hung in the air. The town's reaction was a mix of shock and denial. Some said Harold was possessed. Others claimed he had gone mad, But those who knew him closely said he wasn't, that he was always calm, lucid, even kind. And that made it all the worse, because if a seemingly normal man could do something like that, then no one was safe from their own humanity. As investigators analyzed the evidence, they began to realize there was a method to it all. Harold had created an almost industrial system where each part of the process had a specific function. It was important to understand that this wasn't improvisation. It was organization, discipline, calculation. And this realization was what disturbed the agents most. The horror there wasn't in the blood or bones, but in the coldness. The press tried to decipher what would drive someone to do what Harold did. Psychiatrists spoke of disorders, journalists spoke of trauma, religious figures spoke of possession. But deep down, no one had any answers. There was only the fact. An ordinary man had become the center of a story that went beyond crime and became a symbol of something much greater, of what hides beneath the veneer of normality. Harold's confession, if it could even be called that, came weeks later. During the interrogation, he spoke calmly, describing his routine as if he were talking about a simple job. He said the victims didn't suffer, that everything was quick, as it should be, that he believed he was helping to maintain the cycle of life. These phrases echoed among the investigators like a profane mantra. There was no emotion, there was no remorse, only logic. And upon hearing that, Daniel Cooper understood he wasn't dealing with a monster. Monsters are distant creatures invented to justify what we don't understand. Harold was human, and that was what hurt the most, because it meant anyone, under the right conditions, could cross that same line. After the arrest, the town tried to rebuild, but the soil of Cold Creek was never the same. Every rain brought memories. Every sound from the woods seemed to carry echoes of everything that had been discovered. And somehow, Harold was still there, not as a man, but as a living reminder that evil doesn't come from the dark, it comes from silence. Comment here. That makes sense to me. Trying to understand Harold Mason's mind was like trying to see the bottom of a bottomless well. None of the researchers, not even the most experienced psychiatrists, could accurately describe what was happening behind that calm, empty gaze. During interrogations, Harold spoke as if he were explaining a simple, everyday task. He displayed no guilt, no hatred, no pleasure, just a cold, almost scientific conviction. He said that everything he did was part of the natural balance of things, that the world had always fed the world, and that he had simply found a way to optimize the process. This methodical mindset baffled experts. Some believed he suffered from a rare psychotic disorder. Others saw him as a classic psychopath, incapable of empathy and driven only by control. But there was something different about Harold, something that didn't fit any traditional diagnosis. He didn't seem to seek power, nor did he take pleasure in suffering. He seemed to believe. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this is precisely where the darkest and most disturbing part of this story begins, the one that goes beyond crime and invades the realm of the human mind. What leads a person to look at death and see a purpose in it? What transforms an ordinary man into someone capable of feeding animals with human remains without batting an eye? During the psychological exams, Harold maintained the same tone of voice, slow and steady, as if he were giving an interview about agriculture. He described his childhood in detail, his strict father, the isolation, the long hours spent in silence in the fields. He said he learned early on that life in the countryside was about exchange, about giving and receiving. The land gives you what you need, but demands what it wants in return, he said. When the psychologist asked what he meant by that, he replied, "Nature doesn't waste, and I learned to be like her." These words became something of a riddle. To some, they sounded like delirium, to others like twisted philosophy. But for everyone, they left the same feeling. Harold wasn't crazy. He was entirely rational. He didn't act on impulse, and that made it all the more terrifying. The Dr. Laura Hastings, a criminal behavior expert, wrote in his report, "Harold Mason represents the very point where logic becomes monstrous. His mind was not dominated by chaos, but by extreme order. He organized death as one organizes a harvest." This phrase resonated with investigators, because somehow Harold believed he was restoring a kind of natural justice. He saw himself as an intermediary between man and the earth, an enforcer of a balance that, in his mind, had been broken. This belief brought him closer to other little-known killers, such as Albert Fish or Robert Pickton, who also mixed perversion with purpose, madness with method. The pattern was always the same: isolation, loneliness, a childhood marked by rejection, and a distorted sense of purpose. But unlike them, Harold seemed driven by something even deeper, a mystical belief that his role was necessary, almost sacred. In one of the interviews, the psychologist asked, "Do you understand that what you did is wrong?" Harold was silent for a few seconds, then replied, "Wrong for whom? The error lies in the weakness, not in the act." It was at that moment that the expert realized he was not dealing with an ordinary killer, but with someone who had created his own logic, a kind of inner doctrine where morality and crime were intertwined. The most disturbing thing is that at times Harold could be convincing. He spoke with such clarity, such serenity, that it was hard not to feel momentarily swept away by his twisted logic. This is the true power of manipulation, when evil learns to speak with the voice of reason. And this is where a thought comes in that bothers many people, perhaps because it's true. Evil rarely presents itself as evil. It disguises itself as purpose, method, conviction. The line that separates a normal mind from that of someone like Harold isn't as wide as we'd like to believe. It's made up of small decisions, silences, justifications that seem harmless at first, one step at a time, until the abyss no longer seems like a precipice and becomes just part of the path. This is the scariest part, realizing that Harold's madness didn't come from nowhere. It was built slowly, based on ideas that seemed rational, believing that everything has a purpose, that nature balances itself, that suffering is part of the cycle. How many times do we ourselves use similar justifications without realizing the underlying logic? Psychiatrists claim that the human mind has an infinite capacity for adaptation, and sometimes it's precisely this capacity that leads us to ruin. Harold adapted to his own deviation. He accepted it, nurtured it until he transformed it into truth. And when someone believes too much in their own version of the truth, everything that deviates from it becomes disposable. People, values, laws, everything becomes part of a system they themselves created. Deep down, Harold Mason didn't want destruction. He wanted control. And that's his most dangerous trait of all, because the desire for control, when it surpasses the limits of empathy, turns anyone into something unpredictable. He believed he was part of a larger plan, when in reality he was just a man trapped within his own organized madness. Even after all the studies and reports, no one has been able to answer the question that echoed throughout Cold Creek. Was Harold born this way? Or was he made who he was? The question still divides experts and the curious, and perhaps the answer will never come, because understanding evil is always an exercise in looking at what is most human in us, and that in itself is frightening. Comment here. That makes sense to me. The Harold Mason trial was the event that redefined Cold Creek forever. For the first time, the quiet, forgotten town made national headlines. Journalists from across the country lined the dusty streets, parking pickup trucks packed with equipment in front of the small courthouse that until then had only heard neighborly disputes and chicken thefts. The cameras captured the same man everyone had greeted at the fair for years. But now he was in an orange uniform, handcuffed, walking slowly, his gaze downcast and the same calm expression as ever. It was strange and deeply uncomfortable to see that familiar face inside a glass cage. During the hearings, Harold rarely spoke. He watched silently as the prosecutors described every gruesome detail, every piece of evidence collected on his farm: fragmented bones, modified tools, DNA samples, forensic reports detailing the horror hidden beneath the soil of Cold Creek. The witnesses trembled, the audience wept, but Harold remained motionless, as if none of it concerned him. Sometimes he closed his eyes as if bored, or as if mentally reliving something only he understood. The prosecutor, in one of his most striking remarks, said, "What we have here is not just a murderer. This is a man who believed he had power over the cycle of life. He turned his farm into an altar of death, and saw himself as a rural god who decides who lives and who dies." The phrase was reproduced by all the newspapers the next day. Some said it was a metaphor. Others swore it was literal. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what happened inside that courtroom revealed not only the extent of Harold's crimes, but also human fragility in the face of the truth. Many residents refused to attend the hearings. Others showed up every day, as if searching for a way to understand how the man who mended fences and sold fresh milk had become the center of a collective nightmare. Some carried rosaries, others folded pieces of newspaper with photos of the victims. It was a mixture of anger and the need to see justice served. The psychiatrists invited by the defense tried to argue that Harold suffered from religious delusions and moral perception disorders. They claimed he truly believed he was serving a higher purpose. The prosecution, however, insisted he was perfectly conscious, rational, and cold-hearted, that every act had been calculated. In the end, the sentence came without hesitation: life, imprisonment without parole. But even after hearing the verdict, Harold just looked up and said, "You will forget. The land not." These were the last words he uttered in public. Cold Creek's reaction was divided. Some celebrated the end of the nightmare, believing justice had been served. Others, however, plunged into a kind of collective mourning, not just for the victims, but for what the town had lost: the innocence, the sense of community, the trust. Many residents left the area, unable to continue living where it all happened. Churches held services, but even faith seemed shaken. Some said Harold's presence had contaminated the soil. That evil, once planted, could no longer be uprooted. The farm was sealed off for months, converted into a research site. Then the government ordered its complete demolition. The structures were torn down, the corral destroyed, and the barn burned to ashes. But those who witnessed the process assure us that the smell never disappeared. The smoke had a distinct odor, reminiscent of iron and damp meat. It was as if the past lingered in the form of air. Even so, human curiosity didn't leave the place alone. Years later, adventurers, journalists, and storytellers began visiting the abandoned site. They recorded videos, took photos, and searched for traces of what remained. And thus, a kind of macabre tourism was born. Young people went there at night to test their courage, filming shadows among the bushes and noises they swore came from underground. Soon legends arose. Some claimed to hear footsteps in the mud, others the sound of buckets being dragged, and still others claimed to have seen a man standing near the gate, wearing a hat and watching silently. The same calm, expressionless gaze as Harold Mason. The press, of course, loved the story. Sensationalist programs rekindled the story, describing the farm as cursed. Documentaries emerged, mixing fact and rumor. And all the while, Cold Creek desperately tried to erase its past. The city ordered the removal of all signs bearing the town's name and even proposed an official change. But bureaucracy and resistance from some residents prevented it. It was as if the name had become a scar, impossible to erase, but also impossible to forget. For the scientific community, Harold Mason's case continued to be studied as an extreme example of psychological deviation combined with rationality. For the religious, He was proof that evil can take human form, and for the common people he became just a story no one wants to hear at night, but one everyone tells when fear needs a face. Harold died a few years later inside the prison, under circumstances never fully clarified. Some say it was a heart attack. Others claim he simply stopped eating, as if he had already fulfilled his perceived purpose. His body was never claimed, and the state buried him in a mass grave. No ceremony, no name on the headstone, just a number. But curiously, after his death, strange reports began. Prison guards reported hearing noises coming from the empty cell, the sound of boots dragging on the floor, as if someone was still walking there. And that's where this story takes a new turn. Because Harold Mason's true impact wasn't what he did, but what he left behind. An invisible trail that still lingers over Cold Creek, a kind of emotional shadow that shaped an entire generation. Young people who grew up hearing the stories of the missing now avoid the road that leads to the old site. They say the wind changes as you get closer, that the air gets heavier, that sometimes you can hear the distant sound of pigs, even though there are no longer any around. This mixture of fear and fascination is what keeps the story alive, because human beings have this strange need to gaze into the abyss, to get closer to horror, as if to understand what lies within. And perhaps what truly frightens us isn't what Harold did, but the fact that we know he was one of us, an ordinary man, with an ordinary farm in an ordinary town, until one day everything shattered. Today, the land is empty, but they say that at night you can still hear the animals waiting for dinner. Comment here. That makes sense to me. There's something deeply disturbing about stories like Harold Mason's, not just because of what he did, but because of what his existence reveals about us. When an entire city spends years greeting a man like that, unaware of what was happening behind the chain-link fences, it's inevitable to ask, how well do we really know the people around us? How many facades, how many smiles of apparent normality hide something no one would dare imagine? This is the kind of reflection that lingers even after the headlines fade. Cold Creek, never fully recovered. Decades have passed, but an eerie atmosphere still lingers over the place, as if time stood still the day Harold was taken. Older people avoid talking about the case, as if words have the power to awaken something. A dormant. Younger people, who grew up hearing distorted versions of the story, dismiss it as urban legend, but they still avoid driving at night along the road that leads to the old site. It's an invisible wound, but one that remains raw. A scar that shaped the town's identity and, in a way, transformed its residents into eternal witnesses to something they'd rather forget. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's something fascinating about the impact stories like this. They reveal how much human beings are drawn to darkness, even when they try to avoid it. There's a natural curiosity for the inexplicable, the forbidden, for what defies logic. It's as if, by understanding evil, we try to protect ourselves from it, as if looking at the shadows helps us better understand the light. But it's not always that simple. Sometimes what we find in the dark isn't just a reflection of the other. It's a reflection of something that exists within us. Many criminologists who have studied Harold's case argue that the most frightening aspect wasn't the number of victims, nor the method. It was the fact that he lived among ordinary people for so long without arousing suspicion. And this raises an uncomfortable question. Does evil need to have a menacing appearance to be recognized, or is it better disguised when it blends into routine? Perhaps the true danger lies in banality, in the rehearsed kindness, the mechanical good morning, the silence that avoids questions. Harold's farm, or what remains of it, has become a symbolic point of this human duality. Some see it as a cursed place where evil has left its mark. Others, however, say the land represents the end of a cycle, the point where the truth came to light, where the horror was exposed and, in a way, purified by time. In a twisted way, it's almost as if history has taught the town something, the importance of not ignoring the signs, of not pretending the strange is merely coincidence. Over the years, the Mason case has become a modern myth, used by professors, journalists, and even filmmakers to discuss the nature of evil and the limits of empathy. Documentaries, books, and films have each attempted to recreate the atmosphere of Cold Creek, each in its own way. Some focused on the brutality of the crimes, others on the psychology behind them. But what they all share is the same sense of unease, the one that arises when we realize that evil comes not from monsters lurking in the shadows, but from people who seem too ordinary to attract attention. Perhaps Harold Mason's greatest legacy lies not in the detective stories, but in the way he forces us to rethink our own perceptions. The human mind is a labyrinth of decisions, and the most dangerous ones are not always born of pure evil. Sometimes they stem from ego, loneliness, a sense of power, or the blind belief that one is doing the right thing. This is the hidden truth behind many crimes. Evil rarely recognizes itself as such. It justifies itself, organizes itself, and masks itself. And when it finally reveals itself, the damage has long since been done. The town of Cold Creek learned this the hard way. The church never filled up like it once did. The market, where Harold sold milk and meat, closed months after the trial. The field where the farm once stood became an empty space, overrun by tall weeds and a constant wind. But every now and then, curious visitors swear they hear the sound of something moving through the trees. Some say it's just nocturnal animals, others claim it's something else entirely, like heavy, shuffling footsteps that stop when listening closely. And the most intriguing thing is that, even without proof of anything supernatural, people continue to believe, perhaps because fear is the last link between the past and the present. Perhaps because Cold Creek needs this fear to keep the memory of what happened alive, to avoid making the same mistake of ignoring what was right before their eyes. After all, denial has always been tragedy's greatest ally. This story is a cruel reminder of how horror can disguise itself as routine, and how indifference is one of the most silent forms of complicity. Harold Mason may have been the protagonist of the terror that stained Cold Creek, but he never acted alone. Every averted glance, every stifled suspicion, every convenient silence, all of it fueled the monster he became. And perhaps this is the most bitter lesson of all. Evil only flourishes when the fear of acting is greater than the fear of knowing. Today, the land where it all happened is surrounded by a rusty iron fence. No animals tread it, no plants grow properly. The winds that pass through Cold Creek seem to carry memories. And there are nights when the silence is so profound that you can hear the distant sound of something metallic clanging, as if someone, somewhere, is still working. Cases like this make us realize how intertwined darkness and humanity are, as if each were a mirror of the other. Ultimately, perhaps what scares us most about Harold Mason isn't what he did, but the fact that he was, to some extent, an extreme version of what we all could be if we allowed conscience to be replaced by justification. And that's why stories like this keep being told, because as long as curiosity, fear, and the quest to understand the inexplicable persist, they never truly die. They simply change form, reappearing where least expected, between the lines of a news story, in the whispers of a city, or in the silence of a forgotten road. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, you've probably already realized that this channel isn't just about crime or dark stories. It's about understanding what lies behind each mystery, what moves people, and what sometimes makes us see humanity even in the densest shadows. And if this kind of reflection makes you think, if this delve into the hidden side of the human mind awakens the same curiosity that brought me here, then this is the place for you. Take advantage of this moment and subscribe to the channel. That way, you'll continue to be part of this journey with me, a journey that goes far beyond stories, and that always offers a new perspective on what's real, what's moral, and what's hidden in between. Also, leave a comment to let me know you made it to the end. Write, "I'm with you until the end." It's the simplest way for me to know that this story kept you hooked until the very last second. And believe me, that makes all the difference in me continuing to bring you content that truly resonates with you. And of course, if this story touched you in any way, please leave a like. Not out of habit, but because that's what makes the algorithm understand that this type of content needs to continue. Stories that make you think, feel, and question. Now, there's a video right here that directly connects to what we talked about today. Click on it and stay with me. There, because what follows will leave you with even more questions than answers.